I want to start with this question of who are you? Okay, just think about for a second the question, who are you? How would you answer that? And I know we're in a church setting, so not the Sunday school answer, all right? If you were at a party and you were introduced to someone and you had to explain to them quickly who you are, and you could only share three things, what would that be? For instance, if I was at a party and I'd say, well, my name's Scott, obviously, and I might share, you know what, I grew up in the London area, and my dad's family grew up in the Hamilton area, and my mom's family, actually, my mom was born in Africa. She was a missionary's kid, so she's from Africa, came to Canada when she was 18. So I might share something along those lines. Just as I was thinking through this whole issue of identity, and I've stopped to think about it because identity has become such a subject in our culture. I mean, there's identity politics. People talk about intersectionality. There's identity theft. Actually, someone who works with me was the victim of identity theft the other day. And obviously the broader discussions around personal identity is a big discussion. As I thought about it though, and I thought historically, just some observations I made, is that historically, and it's kind of reflected in the way you shared, historically people would gain their sense of identity in commonly grounded areas and categories. Things like gender, I'm a man or a woman, parents, who's my family are, where did I come from, my family heritage, my nationality, my country of origin, I'm a Canadian or I'm whatever, race or religion. And so we still see that really when people are kind of in common parlance. That's still how we kind of interact. If you want to know who I am, I tell you about my family, my work, those kinds of things. And we still see that a bit. What's interesting that I've observed, so I've done this talk with some university age students actually at a Christian camp. So they were the core staff, and I go every year to do training with them. And I took them through this discussion around identity, and I had them do the same exercise that you did. We took a little bit longer, and I had them break into pairs. Introduce yourself to the person next to you so they can introduce you to the group after, and we would do that. And obviously some of the typical came up, I'm at University of Guelph, I'm in biology or whatever. But what I was interested in was how often much more of the discussion turned to, this is Rebecca, and she's got a real heart for people who are down and out. And she's a really compassionate person, or this is Joe, and he really loves, horses, and he's got a real passion for. They were turning to those more kinds of personality descriptions than necessarily those objective categories. But historically, it's been these kind of objective categories where people would primarily look to these things outside of themselves from which they would derive their sense of identity. In other words, these things gave a person their sense of who they were. Your family gave you that sense of groundedness, of who you were in the world. Same with your country or your nation. Anyway, what I realized and what I've been observing is that there's been a shift in thinking in our culture. And I like to look at, in terms of Western culture, I like to look at the broad strokes of thought through time. And a lot of us might look to the kinds of identity discussions that are happening right now within the culture, and we think this is a recent phenomenon. And what I see is looking back at the train of ideas moving through Western history. Really, I see us now in a place in this world, really, which is the result or the culmination of thoughts and ideas that began emerging, I think, up to and even before 200 years ago. Of course, it's not the development of thought is never a straight line, and it's never just one or two people, but key ideas tend to be centered around key figures of history. And I've got Darwin on the board here because I think much of the shift that we see taking place in the subject of identity or the thoughts around identity, I think we can trace right back to Darwin in terms of where those ideas have moved from. Of course, Darwin, we know as, sometimes we think of him as the man who brought evolution to the West, but he wasn't. Evolutionary thought was coming for quite a while before Darwin. Darwin's contribution was to come to the subject of evolution and find a way to relieve evolutionary development of any outside influence, i.e. any divine influence, which was still in the mindset of even evolutionary thinkers in his time. They looked at the world almost like a giant clock or a machine. They saw that there were natural processes evolving and things, but they saw that and recognized, they looked and saw the imprint of a designer, of some brilliant mind. And Darwin did not subscribe to that. And he wrestled and thought through of how it could be possible that, that an omnipotent, loving, divine creator could produce a world such as the one that we find ourselves in. And a lot of his personal life was tied up in there, including the death of a daughter and his own chronic illness, and as well as his observations of the world. But one of the major thoughts that Darwin came up with was this. And he states this is in his Origin of the Species. He says, the old argument of design in nature, in other words, he's talking about Genesis 1, which formerly seemed to me to be so conclusive, fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. See, what natural selection allowed him to do was to say, you know what? We now have an explanatory mechanism to explain everything through natural laws. So his conclusion was, everything in nature we can point to and say, look, we can see that is the result of natural laws. And of course, on the Origin, that really focused around the whole area of biological life. But then Darwin moved on from there in The Descent of Man. He realized, well, it doesn't just apply to biology, but it must also apply to psychology, to the way we think. And developing out of there were, ideas on how man socializes, etc. So this really began a snowball effect of thinking in the area of thought. One person who it had a great impact on was someone you may have heard of, Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a philosopher. He was most famous for stating in his book that God was dead. He said, God is dead. Now, he didn't mean by that we had actually killed God. He would have subscribed to Darwin's theory, and he would have believed that from Darwin's theory, the very notion of God was itself an evolutionary development. That it was something we created in order to cope or form our cohesive society or a way to live in the world. And now what Darwin had done is he had freed us from that illusion. So now we could see the world as it really was, so he thought. And so he said, what we've done is we've killed God, or at least the need for the idea of God. He said, God is dead, so let us be involved in the creation of our own new table of values. We want to be those who give themselves their own law, those who create themselves. You see, Nietzsche realized the conclusions of Darwin's theory. If everything is the result of natural laws, that includes our own moral sense, our own table of values, which historically we got from religious tradition. Well, Darwin has freed us from all of that. We realize there's no God out there giving us our sense of right and wrong or anything else. And so now being left with that vacuum, what are we going to do? And Nietzsche concluded, well, the only thing we can do, we have to create our sense of values. We have to construct them. In essence, we have to be creatures who create themselves. His logic was correct, starting from what Darwin introduced. So following Nietzsche then, a contemporary with Nietzsche, was another man influenced by Darwin's theories, John Stuart Mills, who was called the father of modern liberalism. And Mills took Darwin's idea and applied it in the socio-political realm. Well, if everything is ultimately the development of physical laws, then that includes social structure. And if there is no transcendent value set to guide us, then how are we going to form a cohesive society? How are we going to govern ourselves in a way that'll make sense and that won't explode and blow apart so that it won't become total chaos and everyone's doing what they want? And so Mills came up with the idea, or realized, I don't know quite how he came to this conclusion, but trying to find a common denominator in terms of a place to start. How do we form laws? How do we form principles that will guard and protect and bring about the best life for every possible person? And so he recognized that, well, if we're looking for a kind of a foundational principle, it has to be this. It has to be the principle of individual rights. You see, when it comes down to it, we realize if there's no one out there governing me, if there's no God who oversees us, then that means ultimately I'm responsible for myself. Ultimately, I determine those kinds of self-regulating values and morals and laws. So ultimately, it's the individual who's sovereign. There's no ultimate thought or ultimate value set coming from a creator that is sovereign over us now. So what is sovereign? Well, some would want to say the state's sovereign, and that leads to totalitarianism. But as a liberal thinker, Mills realized, no, what is sovereign is the right of the individual. The individual is sovereign. And so that became the basic principle. Now, when you realize that, and you look at our own our own constitutional structure. I mean, look at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's built on this one principle, right? Ultimately, to protect the right of the individual. That's how our laws are really framed and formed. Well, these ideas moved along. There was one other thinker who this influenced significantly, and it's a man by the name of Michael Foucault. And if you've ever studied at a university in the humanities, you've probably come across him. He was a historian and a philosopher as well. And he was particularly interested in the areas around the development of sexuality. But he very much latched onto Nietzsche's ideas as a philosopher, this whole idea of self-creation. And Foucault brought this idea into the humanities. He said, look, from the idea that the self is not given to us, that's from Nietzsche, he says, I think there's only one practical consequence. We have to create ourselves. This is self-creation. This is Nietzsche's idea of self-creation. But Foucault's idea was we create ourselves how? As a work of art. And he very much practiced what he preached. His notion was that we create ourselves as a piece of art using the palette. What's the color palette we use to paint this picture, this work of art? Well, it's the color palette of human experience. Well, which human experiences? Which are the ones we should use? And his assessment was, look, if we're going to paint a truly beautiful picture, we have to use all of the colors available. And so that meant there was no human experience which could not be experimented with or used to paint your own self-created picture or your created picture of yourself. So anyway, that's a really quick sketch, and in some ways it's very simplistic. So if you're a philosopher of history and you want to pick some bones with the details, you can do that with me afterwards, and I'll gladly accept your criticism. I realize it's a bit of a caricature sketch, but it does, I think, provide you with a good sense that how ideas impact other ideas. That we didn't arrive where we are in a vacuum. It's not that one day people decided to think differently. We're the product of the ideas we've received from people in the past. The way we think impacts the way we live. So over the past 150 years, though, if you wanted to just look kind of to a very basic shift that's taken place, I see this shift has very much happened. That historically, in terms of the subject of identity, how we determine that sense of who I am in the world, historically, we would derive that. People would derive it from their family, right? And some cultures are still that way. It's very much about family connectedness. How you behave in the world is an issue of honoring your family and your ancestors. So that's still very much in play in some parts in the world, but not in the West, or not broadly speaking anyway. It's shifted really from deriving my identity from things outside of myself. They give me my sense of self, to really I create my identity. That I learn to I guess, paint a picture of who I truly am through various means. Most of those have to do with really introspection from a subjective sense of looking inside.